I have it.
I have it.
Wayne, can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay.
You sound like Wayne volume up now.
Well, we'll give Miss Deanie about another minute or so, and then we'll go ahead and get started. But while we're waiting on her, we can maybe get started with prayer requests. Mr. Johnny's already shared with us that Mr. Charles said he's doing a little better, although when Johnny spoke to him, that it sounded like he was a little bit out of it.
Sure. And keep my wife in prayer too. She got that type A flu.
Oh, my. Okay.
Yeah. Being a daycare provider, that's where she got it from.
Oh, yeah. Being around those children, you pick up something all the time. Any other prayer concerns?
Juanita Ballard.
Okay, Juanita. Anyone else?
My mother's been having some kidney problems.
Okay.
So keep her in your thoughts and prayers, if you will.
Sure will.
Kidney.
How about you, Wayne?
Yeah, I was trying to unmute it. Just keep up my manager, Bobby Castro. He went to the hospital today for urgent care. He's gonna be out of work until the 11th with the flu.
Oh my.
Yeah. So I definitely lifting him up in prayer.
Okay.
And just me and my wife.
Okay.
Nothing's wrong, but hey, it ain't nothing wrong with asking for prayer.
Amen, brother. Amen. I'd ask y'all keep me in your prayers too. I'm gonna have a little medical test tomorrow. Hopefully it's nothing serious. I don't think it is, but we'll go ahead and get through with that, and let's pray for good results on that. If you don't mind praying with me. Also, we'll pray for Miss Deanie tonight because I haven't heard from her, and if she's not here, that's kind of strange. So maybe she'll either send me a message or maybe she'll join us when she can shortly. Also, I've got a friend who's a colleague in ministry. He's one of our traditional students at the main campus in the religion department. And he and his wife are going through a really difficult time right now. And as bad as he wants to reconcile things, he's not wanting to. So it's very difficult. So please pray for, his name is Jose, and he wouldn't mind me asking for prayer for him and his wife tonight.
Yes, so that's the Jose?
Yeah, Jose.
Okay.
All right. Well, let's begin with the word of prayer then. Father God, we are thankful tonight for all your blessings in life. Lord, we do pray tonight for Miss Deanie, not knowing where she is, Lord, and just hoping that she is well wherever she is and that she can join us, maybe even in just a few moments and be in class with us. If not, at least to be able to have this wonderful technology, Lord, where she'll be able to watch the time where we have in class together tonight so she can keep up with class and understand what's going on with the detailed analysis and the synthesis of the exegetical process. Lord, tonight we also pray for Miss Juanita, Lord, and Miss Nyoka and her family. You know the need, you know the burden that's there, Lord. Pray for Mr. Johnny tonight and his wife specifically with the flu that she's suffering with, and also Jeff's mother, Lord, what she's going with, and Wayne's manager, Lord, who's also got the same flu. Lord, it's just a very difficult time with a lot of sickness being passed back and forth, and we just pray for those who are under the weather and who are sick. Lord, tonight we also pray for Mr. Charles, that you will continue to be with him and his wife as he continues to convalesce and get well. Lord, we pray also tonight for those who will be having medical tests run, Lord, including myself tomorrow, that all things will come out well, Lord, and all things will work out in accordance with thy will. We pray for Wayne and his wife tonight, Lord, and their household. We just lift them up before you and ask that you'll strengthen their their marriage, their life, their household, Lord, that you will bless them manifoldly, Lord, with all kinds of blessings, Lord, whether it be physical, spiritual, emotional, Lord, whatever the blessings are that you have for his family in store, just pour them out upon him. And also tonight, Lord, for Jose and his wife and their family, Lord, I just pray for them and ask that you'll be with them. Lead us and guide us and direct us in everything that is said and done tonight as we continue to learn this process and continue to grow. For all things, Lord, we give you thanks and praise in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, everyone. So before we get started with the detailed analysis and synthesis, which are the two things we're going to talk about tonight, that will be the next paper that you're going to have come and due, right? I think at the end of this week on Isaiah chapter 7, 1 through 15. You're going to be doing the detailed analysis section now, and you're going to be doing the synthesis section. So elements number 4 and number 5 will be turned in together at the end of this week. So we're going to talk about it tonight, make sure everybody has a good understanding of it. But before we do that, I just want to make sure if anyone has any questions about the previous 3 steps to this point. Survey. I think survey is pretty self-explanatory. It's pretty easy, right? You know, just asking questions that come to your mind as you begin to process this whole thing. Then you get into the contextual analysis, which has history, cultural, social, political, and the actual placement of the text in the book that you're studying. Where is it placed at, and why do you think it's placed there, which are both literary and rhetorical analysis. And then also maybe a canonical analysis. Where is that passage at in the Bible, and does that make any difference? And sometimes it makes a difference and sometimes it don't. So it may or may not be in your research, or it may or may not be in your paper, depending on what passage you're looking at, but at least ask the question. And then of course we move to the formal analysis, which we talk about the genre of the book that is being written, the passage is written in. We talk about the form of the passage itself. What is the form of the passage? Is it parable? Is it narrative or story? Is it poetry? What is the form of it? Is it designed? Is it a pun? What is its design of the form to try to carry meaning across? And are there any literary analysis that needs to be made, such as if there's simile, metaphor, personification, and things like that, where the author is using literary devices to try to carry across meaning in the text? And then we talk about structure, and then we talk about the movement of the text, right? So are there any questions about those elements up to this point, or do we feel comfortable with that?
That literary, how you say it? Literary.
Literary. And what's confusing about literary is there's the literary context, and then there's the literary analysis. And I wish he would have used 2 different words, because you can get confused. Literary context is, where is the passage at in the book that you're studying? Is it at the beginning, in the center, at the end? And does that matter? And if it matters, how does it matter? Why do you think it is? And that's the rhetorical. So there's literary and rhetorical context that are side by side, and that's in the contextual analysis. When you move to the formal analysis, now you're talking about literary devices that the author may have used to try to convey meaning. So that's more like literary analysis, not literary context. So if you're a little bit confused there, I understand, and I'd like to take baby steps and walk us through it, make sure everybody understands it. So did you have a question about literary analysis or context, Johnny?
Right, because he had said literary forms, and that's where I was lost. I went back trying to read and understand what was the literary word, but it just kept throwing me off.
So literary forms is usually, that's under the literary analysis part in the formal analysis. That's in the second element, right?
Right.
And so that's personification or metaphor or simile or, different kinds of literary devices that the author may be using to try to convey meaning. So what you would be looking for, you know what a simile is, right? A simile is a statement that uses like or as, usually, to make a comparison. God is like a father, right? He has the characteristics of a father: love, compassion. He provides for us. He looks after, secures us. all the things that a father would give to us, a good father, that is. So when you see that like word, you know that there's a simile being used, right? God is like a father, even though it could also say God is a father, and he is a father. He's the father of Jesus. He's the father of all mankind. He's father in many different ways. But metaphor doesn't use like or as, and uses just the symbolism of something without the like or as in there. So God is a rock, not God is like a rock. Like God is as if a rock. So like or as is taken out. And that's a metaphor, right? So God is not technically a rock, but what is he trying to say? He's trying to say God is strong, God is powerful, God is mighty, God is unbreakable. What is a rock? What are the characteristics of a rock? So when he's talking about literary forms that might be being used, also personification is another one that I've mentioned a couple of times in this discussion already, just so you'll know. There are times when something that is an inanimate object is given human characteristics, and that's called personification. So you make, let's say you make the trees personified when it says God comes down from the mountains, and as he comes down, the trees clap their hands and the trees shout and praise God, right? So that's personifying the trees, and they're acting like if they're humans by shout, because trees don't really have hands, right? But yet they're somehow clapping their hands. That's a personification. That's a literary device that's used to try to help convey meaning, that even creation itself is jubilant and excited to see God when God comes, because that means everything's going to be okay, right? So does that make sense about literary?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Does that answer your question about literary devices or forms?
Yes, sir.
Okay. But like I said, just be careful, because if you're going systematically through these 3 steps, the second step, that is historical and cultural and social political, that step also has in it what's called the literary context, which is really just asking, where is this passage in this book? What is its literary context? Where's it at in the literature? And if it's in a particular place, it might have a rhetorical context. Why is it there? The rhetorical point is, what is he trying to say by putting it right at the beginning? What is he trying to say by putting it in the middle? What is he or she trying to say by putting it at the end? Okay?
Yes.
So just don't let those 2 things confuse you, because the formal analysis is talking about literary forms and literary devices. The other one is talking about just where the passage is in the book. All right. Any other questions about the first 3 steps before we move on to the next 2? All right. If not, let's look on page 101 at the detailed analysis of the text section. And let's look at what he says a detailed analysis is. Now, by the way, in another place in this book, he tells us that detailed analysis will generally be about 50% of your paper.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to do a lot of research in detailed analysis, even if you don't do as much research in historical, cultural, literary, and all these other things we've talked about at this point. You want to do as much research as you need to do in all of them, but you really want to research heavily in detailed analysis. And the reason it's called detailed analysis is because you're analyzing every detail of the text at this point, and this is why it's going to be 50% of your paper. Okay? So if you're doing a 10-page paper for an exegetical research paper for a class like, say, this one, how much would your detailed analysis need to be if it's going to be following the textbook? About 5 pages, Jeff. That's right. So 50%, right? So if you were doing 10 page, you'd probably do about a half a page of introduction, about a good half a page, 2 paragraphs of introduction. You jump into historical context, you're going to do about a page and a half of that. That gets you up to 2 pages. And then you're going to do about a page and a half. It gets you up to 3 pages with formal analysis. Then 5 pages with detailed analysis. That gets you to 8 pages. And now you're down to only 2 pages left to finish up with synthesis and reflection and conclusion. And that's about all you'd need, would be about 2 pages. And that's if you were doing a 10-page paper for a class, which is probably about what you'll end up doing for this class, the paper you're going to be doing. Somewhere between 8 and 10 pages will be your final paper probably. All right. Any questions or comments about that? Does that all make sense? All right, so let's look then at some of the questions that he tells us that we probably want to ask at this point in a detailed analysis. What are the main points of each part of the text, and how does the text or writer make those points? Now, if I were doing this, I would probably have a blank piece of paper and start with these 2 questions, because what I do when I do my exegetical work, even when I was in seminary, I had this book right beside me, this book from Gorman. And as I was going through each step, I was looking at the questions that he was asking that I should be asking, and that's what I would ask. And so I would probably have just an initial page to do these initial 2 questions. And I would ask these questions and sort of answer these questions out on that piece of paper. And then I would just put that page to the side. And then I would go back and look at these more detailed questions we're going to ask in just a minute. But these 2 questions are sort of getting you an overall picture here for detailed analysis, which you've started to kind of develop now that you've done these other 3 steps. What are the main points of the text, and how does the author make those points? And then number 2, what do the details mean in the big picture, and how does the big picture affect the meaning of the details? Now, if you'd like, one way you might be able to think about this process is a jigsaw puzzle. All of you've probably put together a jigsaw puzzle at some point in your life, right? So what about if I gave you one piece of jigsaw puzzle and asked you to tell me what the jigsaw was about, what the puzzle looked like? You really wouldn't be able to tell me, would you? So how do you begin putting together a jigsaw puzzle? Most of the time, we try to find all the pieces that's got a flat side on it, or an edge, or a corner, right? And once you begin to put all those corners on, then you begin to start to see a little bit of a picture. You might start seeing some tree limbs or some tree branches. And if you see a piece of puzzle that looks like it's a piece of wood, or if it looks like bark from a tree or a limb or a bush, then you would probably try to put it in where you're beginning to see those that tree cap, right? And try to see if you can work your way down from that tree. So that's what he's asking here when he says, what do the details mean in light of the big picture? What does each piece mean? Is the piece a bush, a rock, a pond, blades of grass, a horse's tail, a horse's head? It depends on what kind of picture it is, but if it's a picture of a farm, you might have any of those things on any one of those pieces of pictures of that puzzle, right? Mm-hmm. And how does that actually play into the larger, bigger picture? Well, it fits over here with the horse, right? Or that kind of thing. So that might be something that will help you just a little bit when you think about asking these first 2 questions. What is the main point of this text, and how do the details feed into that main point, right? So let's look at it just from the point that we've been dealing with, the Isaiah passage. What's the main point, do you all think, of the sections of that passage? I'll give you an opportunity to think, and I'll give you an opportunity to answer for that.
Which portion? You want to break it up into like 3 separate portions?
Yeah, because you should have probably already started doing like an outline, and you've already got like probably an A, B, and a C, or A, B, C, and a D. You could do it 3 parts, 4 parts. You might only do 2 parts. You might say Isaiah meets Ahaz, part 1. Isaiah gives Ahaz the sign, part 2, and that's all you did. Everybody's going to do it differently, and it's not necessarily any right or wrong way to actually break down the outline. But for me, I like to be as detailed as possible when I'm doing an outline, so I probably would have like 4 or 5 sections of Isaiah 1 through 7, 1 through 15 in a outline. I would probably have like section 1, God tells Isaiah to go to Ahaz. Section 2, Isaiah meets Ahaz and tells him to ask for a sign. Section 3, Ahaz rejects the sign. Section 4, Isaiah says, I'm going to give you a sign anyway. Section 5, Isaiah gives the sign, and it's the young woman who's pregnant with a child and that kind of thing. So you see how I broke it down into 5 different sections? Somebody else might have only done it in 3, but that's okay. That's the freedom of the interpreter to be able to do that. That's not going to really ultimately affect negatively either one of our interpretations necessarily, but like I said, I just like to be a little more detailed. So if we were doing this and we were actually asking the question, what is the main point of each section? Well, for my breakdown, for my outline, we would look at each point. Like, what is the point of the first section? God tells Isaiah to go to tell Ahaz or to go meet Ahaz. What do y'all think is the point of that?
I actually backed up and did my first point being the background information.
Okay.
It talks about the 2 separate kings.
Yep.
And then, talking about the location geographically. And that's how I broke down my first section.
Okay, so what is the main point, do you think, of all of that? Why would he even put that in there? Got to be a reason for him to put it in there, right? He's painting a picture. That's what we're trying to get at again. Isaiah has painted a picture in Isaiah chapter 7, verses 1 through 15. Now you've just broken down one segment of that part that is the historical context of the war, the Syro-Ephraimitic war that's going on. If you're using my model of a puzzle and we're looking at a farm, let's say that one side of the farm has one of those red building, them red barns like you have on a farm where the horses are in the stable and everything. And out in the middle, you've got a green pasture. And on the right-hand side, you got a pond and a weeping willow tree, right? So there's several different segments of this puzzle that we don't even know, but we can look at the box and tell what it's going to look like when it's all over said and done. Well, the first segment of your puzzle that you just gave me, let's just make like it's the red barn, okay? So why put that there? Why even put in there anything about the kings and the alliance that's getting ready to happen and all of that other stuff?
I mean, it goes along with just about all of the Old Testament. They always break down, giving you history, who's the father of who, where they're at.
So he's just basically setting up the whole story, right?
Like coming together.
Yeah, he's telling you this is the context in which Isaiah was told to go to Ahaz, right? If he'd have just started by saying Isaiah was told to go to Ahaz, you'd have said, well, when was that? I mean, that could have been any time during Ahaz's reign, right? But right. Because he told us exactly when it was, we've got the basis of it. So that's part of one of the reasons why that first part that Wayne is talking about was put there. I think that's exactly right. What are some of the details of that first section, Wayne, or anybody? Let's think about the details. What are the details of that first section where he's telling them about all the kings and everything?
Let's see.
The details of that whole section of verses 1 through 2 is the Syro-Ephraimitic alliance.
Back history.
Say again, Nayaka?
History of all the kings.
Yeah, of the ones who are involved in this war, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is telling us that those 2 kings have come together in a formal alliance against Judah, right?
Right.
So that's what the details are. That's the small pieces of the puzzle that looks like tree bark and tree limbs and bushes. Now, when we put them all together, we see the whole puzzle. Oh, this is in the time frame of when Assyria was the big kid on the block as a part of the empire of the world back then. And both Syria and Israel in the north were trying to avoid being taken by the Assyrians. They wanted to fight, but they couldn't fight by themselves, so they wanted Judah to join them. And since Judah wouldn't join them, they have come together to fight against Judah to try to make Judah join them, right?
Right.
So that's the big picture. The big picture is the Syro-Ephraimitic War. The details of the big picture that help us to understand this is the Syro-Ephraimitic War is Jotham and Rezin and Pekah and Remaliah and Syria and the capital of Syria and all of these things that help us to actually put the pieces of the puzzle together. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
All right, we won't do all 5 sections then of Isaiah chapter 7 verses 1 through 15 because that's what you're doing this week for your homework. But we just did the first part of your homework sort of for you, right? To kind of start asking this question about this section. All right, let's look over the next page then. Some basic questions. What does the text communicate and how? What are key terms and images and what do they mean? Now, some of you this past week had put in your paper for last week some definitions of some words, and I put in the margin, save this for your detailed analysis section. I don't know if y'all noticed those notes in the margin. That's because when you get ready to do a word study or definitions of words, it's really good to come under the detailed analysis section. Right here into this part where it says, what are the key terms and images? So some of those words that caught your mind while you were doing your survey that you want to look up and you want to find the definition to, they would be good to hold off until detailed analysis when you start looking them up. And you really ought to try to look them up with a good Bible concordance like Strong's Concordance or something that will give you as much as you can get the original Greek and Hebrew meanings of the words. You do not have to be a Greek scholar to be able to look up a Greek word. Y'all know that. Did we talk about the Strong's Concordance in this class already?
Yes, sir.
We did. Okay, so y'all all know how to access the Hebrew and the Greek words in the Strong's Concordance. Yeah, there you go, Mr. Johnny. Johnny's got one there if you'll hold it up. That's the exhaustive concordance. If it says that word exhaustive on it, that means every word in the Bible, including the definite articles and the conjunctions, but there's so many of those that they're like on a page. There's a whole page where there's about 20 pages of the and 20 pages of and but. And you can go look them all up if you want to, but you really don't usually need to look those up. But the other ones that are in there is every word in the Bible, whether it be grace or faith or authority or king or just any word, every word. And you can look it up. If it's in the Old Testament, you look it up in the Hebrew section of the back of the book. If it's in Greek, you look it up in the Greek section. If it's in the New Testament, look it up in the Greek section. And it's got numbers. I mean, it's not hard to do. You don't have to look up the Greek word. You just look up the number, and then it gives you the Greek word in the definition or the Hebrew word in the definition. So here's where you would do some really good homework on your key words and your key study, your key terms and images.
Would you want us to put the Greek word beside it too?
Not necessarily. If you have the ability to do that, you can. If you're a Greek scholar, if you know how to do Greek a little bit, then yeah, you can certainly do that. I did it in the paper that I did for Campbell on Acts, and you can change the font on Microsoft to be able to put in Greek lettering. It's symbol, but you've got that's the like where it says Time New Romans at the top. You go down, you click and go down to S, and you find symbol. And symbol has the Greek alphabet, but you kind of got to know the Greek alphabet to be able to type the word in. Sometimes I think you can copy it and paste it directly from an electronic resource. If you can find the Greek word online somewhere, you probably could copy it and paste it into the Word document without going through and having to, hunt and peck and whatever to try to type the Greek word in. But you can also do Hebrew lettering too, if you know Hebrew. And like I said, that's something you could do, but you don't have to. The main thing is if you get the word defined in the best dictionary you can possibly find it in. And I would suggest that if you have a word that is a theologically significant word, or if it's a really important word, or if there's a controversy around the word, you do more than just a Strong's Concordance. Do Strong's Concordance for bread. You know, if you want to find out what bread means in the New Testament, the Hebrew word for bread is lechem. And so Bethlehem, beit is the Hebrew word for house, and lechem is the word for bread, but it also means food in general, but usually it means bread. So Bethlehem, beit lechem, is just two words that in Hebrew means the house of bread. It's kind of ironic, isn't it, that Jesus was born in Bethlehem and he is the bread of life. That's something that you can make a connection and preach, right? I've made that point in a Christmas sermon before, that the very word of the city and town that Jesus was born in means house of bread. And Jesus was born the bread of life and laid in a manger in Bethlehem. Now, why Bethlehem was named house of bread is probably because it was more fertile for growing barley and grains and crops that would make bread, wheat. So it was probably, quote unquote, the bread basket. But to me, it's more than happenstance or coincidence that the city that Jesus, the bread of life, was born in was called the house of bread, if that makes sense. But how would you find that? You go and you look in your dictionary and you find that information. But like in the one that we're doing in Isaiah, virgin is a very controversial thing because it's changed in the New Revised Standard Version to young woman. And in the King James, it says virgin, right? So I would probably go and try to look that up in the Anchor Bible Dictionary. If you can find the word virgin, see if it's in the Anchor Bible Dictionary and see if there's a difference in the wording. Because, or of course, you will know by just looking it up in the Strong's Concordance that there is a difference. There's the word Bethulah that always means a virgin in the sense of never having had sex with a man, a woman who's never had sex, which is a virgin technically defined, right? And then there's the other word, Alma, that is used in this verse in Isaiah. And that word doesn't mean virgin exclusively, although it can mean virgin. It means a young woman of childbearing years, a woman of marriageable age. Well, a woman could be a woman of marriageable age who's never had sex with a man and be a virgin and be an Alma. Mm-hmm. But she could also be a young woman who has been married, consummated the union as husband and wife, and even gotten pregnant, and she is still an Alma in Hebrew because the word means a young woman of marriageable age. Now, what she can't be at that point is a Bethulah. No longer, if she's had sex, will she be a Bethulah because she's no longer a virgin. Does that make sense? So there's a little bit of ambiguity in the word Alma. It can mean virgin, but it doesn't have to mean virgin, right? That's going to play importantly in this passage and what it means in its original context to Isaiah and to Ahaz and to Judah. And we'll talk a little bit later in this class tonight about ambiguity and polyvalence or polyvalence of a text and what it means to have that ambiguity built into that text so that it can also have a deeper sense or a deeper or fuller meaning for the Christian community. Okay? All right, so word studies are very important. And if you're going to do a word study, I would do it at this point in detailed analysis. And the way I would do it would be to put the words in just like if you were defining them. And in fact, that's what I did do when I did mine. I would suggest you sort of do it the same way. In fact, if you would just give me a second, I don't know if I've already done this for you all before, but I'm going to pull up a document that I did for Acts chapter 2 and show you a detailed analysis section since we're working through detailed analysis. And what I'll do is, if you all are interested in wanting to do this, if you would like me to send you the document via email so you can kind of look at it yourself and
That's what I
see
need.
what it looks like. Okay. I'm going to try to share my screen. Yes, did you have a question?
Could you send this to me email?
Yeah,
Anything to help?
the paper? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Thank you.
Now, can y'all see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so y'all see the
Yes.
paper. All right. So this was my exegesis when I was at Campbell for the doctoral program. If you notice, the passage, I translated the passage because I have the ability. You know, I did a couple of years of Greek at Mount Olive before I went to seminary, so I knew how to do Greek translation. I can't just sit down and just read it right off the page as good as I'd like to. If I had stuck with it, maybe I could have. But I do still have the ability to sit down with the Greek New Testament and translate it. It'll take a while, but I get there. So I did that. And you see I've got a footnote here. It says, translation mine. Other manuscripts add variations of to the church after added in verse 47. So I gave the footnotes of, you know, what some translations say. But I translated this from the Acts chapter 2, verse 41 through 47. Then I moved into an introduction. So just a catchphrase, a hook phrase, if you will. The second chapter of the book of Acts records exciting events from the specific era along the timeline of salvation history. The reader is privileged to peek through a window into the narrative to enjoy a droplet of an immensely important time. The beginning of chapter recounts the faithfulness of the disciples to tarry in Jerusalem, which results in them receiving authority from heaven in the person, presence, and power of the Holy Spirit. In witnessing the Pentecost event, the reader becomes privy to information concerning the empowerment of the disciples for the work into which they have been called or commissioned. The end of the chapter is equally important as it relates to the best of Luke's research or his source's memory, the very first attempt of the disciples to embody their faith. Now, I want you to notice something. You see that word, that sentence there in the second paragraph, that Luke is trying to relate the very first attempt of the disciples to embody their faith. Well, notice if I back up to the top, what is the title of the paper? An honest attempt to live out our faith, right? So do you see how I've actually titled the paper, what I want to try to prove? And this is sort of the beginning of my thesis statement here. Now, I'm gonna make a couple of caveat statements to say, look, we can't know for sure about certain things, right? So although we dare not count out a possibility of an accretion here or there in minor detail, we can say this for certain, that this is an accurate recounting of an honest attempt of the Christians to embody their faith. Now, here's my thesis. What follows, most of the time when you see what follows, that means that's what the person's getting ready to tell you in the paper, right? So I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you in the paper, or what I'm going to argue for in the paper. What follows is an attempt to prove, that word prove means I'm going to argue this. This is my thesis, that the disciples knew that developing a rich sense of koinonia or community is a constitutive of what it means to be the people of God vis-a-vis embodying the faith. Okay? So now I get into historical context. I'm not going to read this whole paper to you because that would bore you to tears, and I'm going to actually send you the paper, so if you want to read it on your own, you can do that. But what I want you to see is how I've actually segmented it off, okay? So now I've got my introduction and I've got my thesis statement. What am I going to go into? Not survey, because survey is the first step of doing exegesis, and all that is for you to ask questions initially that are raised in you when you read this text. You're not going to make a section in your paper for survey, right? That's just going to be a page that you're going to have in your research that will never be seen by anybody else, and all it is all the questions that this reading has spurred me to want to try to investigate during this investigation. So I jump right into the historical section. All right, and notice I only put into this what I found that will actually found or improve or prove my thesis, that will help me to make my thesis point. I did a lot of research, but not all the research got into the paper. So notice I'm quoting Greco-Roman literature like Virgil and Homer, the philosophy of Stoics and Epicurics and Cynics. Notice that I'm looking at both how Luke understood both Greek philosophy and Hebrew scripture better than any other author or writer. So what I'm doing is I'm building a case, because what I'm trying to get, the point I'm going to try to make in my thesis is the disciples are going to try to live out the authentic faith that Christ taught them while he was with them for those 3 years around about that he was with the disciples. But my suggestion in this paper is going to be that the faith that Jesus taught them is the exact faith that Hebrew people have been given in the Old Testament. Like Christianity is not somehow some newfangled faith. All Christianity is the Hebrew faith of the Old Testament lived out rightly, where we look after the widows and the orphans and the sojourners and the strangers, and we, do all the things that God told his people to do in the Old Testament, right? Jubilee, let the prisoner go free, forgive debts, love and be a part of a community that holds each other accountable. All the things Jesus taught them can come right out of the Old Testament. That's my assertion. So I'm trying to build the point that Luke actually knew all the Greek and all the Hebrew scriptures, and he was very well versed in all of them. So then I start talking about the date when the book was written, which y'all already know. That's a part of historical context, right? Then I move down and talk about who was the book written to. The narrative in and of itself was, the recipient of the narrative was who? Well, Theophilus, whoever that is. And some people have said that means simply God lovers, any God lovers, because the name Theophilus means lover of God. Or it could be a guy by the name of Theophilus. We don't know, but I make the point that it's probably the latter, and I highlight that, and I give footnotes. Notice I jumped into the social context. What is the social context? We're talking about the religion of the day. We're talking about the social belief structures of the day. At this point in the timeline, it's safe to say Christians were all Jewish, right? There ain't no separate Christian church at this point in Acts chapter 2. All people who have accepted Jesus as Messiah are still simply Jews who see Jesus as the literal fulfillment of their Old Testament law and everything, right? He is the Messiah. For them, it's a natural part to still take part of worshiping God in the accepted manner, and that's why it says in Acts they were continually in and out of the temple on a daily basis, right? So that's their social setting. And I also talked about in the social setting, the structure of the society, oppressive mechanisms that had contributed to the systemic poverty. Jesus taught the disciples they had ample time to minister to the poorest amongst them after his resurrection. Notice the footnotes. I want you to take good notice of this. Notice how it's widely researched. I've got I. Howard Marshall, The Acts of the Apostles in the Tyndale New Testament Commentary. I've got David Noel Freeman in the Anchor Bible Dictionary. I've got John, 2 different passages in John I'm highlighting here. I've got Matthew that I'm highlighting. I've got Donald Cabriel, The Upside Down Kingdom. I've got Mark Allen Powell. Notice if a lot of times we have a tendency to get what I call tunnel vision, and we focus on 1 or 2 resources, and all you constantly doing is just putting that same resource down as a footnote. I bid, or, the same footnote. Don't do that. Try to find multiple resources, different sources, so that you're always thinking as you're writing, what might my detractor who is reading this argue against if they're reading it? And if you're using the same resource every time, then your reader would have a legitimate argument to say, well, this is sort of biased because you're only drawing from one person's belief structure. So if you go ahead and research it broadly, when your reader is reading it, they don't have a leg to stand on to say you're biased because you're drawing on one source or two sources or three sources. You've got 14 different sources you're drawing on, and they're like, well, wow, this must be consensus amongst at least a group of Christians, if not every Christian, right? So make it widely resourced. Now I jumped from social to cultural. I talk about the culture of Israel and Palestine, that they were under Roman occupation, that Rome had brought nice roads and a strong military protection, but that it also meant exorbitant taxes and potential collaboration and corruption amongst the Jewish and Roman officials and leaders, right? So I'll let you go through and read it, like I said, but I'm just trying to give you a sense of how I'm building history, social, and cultural under contextual analysis. Does that all make sense? All right, notice this too. If you do a long quote in your paper, this is how you're supposed to format it. This is what I mean if I write back into your paper, you should put this in a block quote format. This is a block quote format. Most of you understand how to do this. If you don't, raise your hand or just give me a acknowledgement. Okay. You're going to make it a smaller font. So what you'll do is you'll probably write it out just like the rest of your text, and it'll be just like this section here. And then you'll highlight it like that. And then you'll go in and you'll say paragraph. You want to change it to single, that kind of thing. You want to change that. And then you want to go back and you want to highlight again. And you want to do the font 10. See how I made it smaller?
Right.
And then you want to come over to the side and you want to put all of it over 5 spaces like that. Right? You don't worry about the right side. The right side will take care of itself. But on the left side, you want the whole quote all like that right there. That makes sense?
Okay.
All right. This is another little trick in case you haven't ever heard this or known this. But if you do something when you're writing in Microsoft and you don't want it to stay that way, or you made a mistake, you still got this little arrow right up here. I don't know if you noticed this or not or known it before, but you just hit that a couple of times, it'll carry you right back to where you were before, right? I just undid everything that I did to show you that example. Okay? So you got your undo button. Now, why did I put this one in a block quote? I've got a bunch of other quotes that are not in block quotes, right? Look at this one right here. There's a quotation. There's where it ends. Here's a quotation. There's where it begins. Here's a quotation. There's where it ends. Why did I put this one in block quote? Because it's 3 lines or more. So the rule of thumb is if it starts quoting right here on however, and it quotes all the way down to here, that's 3 lines, it ought to be in a block quote.
Okay.
Now, if it were just this 3 lines, I would let it slide and not put it in a block quote because it's not 3 full lines, right? You still got 5 spaces here, and you got a few spaces right here. So you probably could get by with not putting that one in block quote. But let's say that it was down here, and it was from Luke here all the way down to down here by the Republic. Should that go in a block quote? Yep. Because it's 1, 2, 3, 4, almost 5 lines at that point. And you see how many lines this one is? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And notice where this information comes from. Another resource, Paul Achtemeier, Introducing the New Testament, Its Literature and Theology. Again, broadly resourced, right? Not pulling from the same resources every time. Now, Gerhard Kittel and the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, the TDNT, or Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, is sort of like a gold standard for looking up words, theological words from the New Testament, Greek words. And so that's why I used it 1, 2, 3, 4 times in a row, right? And then again here 5, and then 6 times. I used it a lot here because it's a very reputable source that everybody would recognize. Okay. All right. Notice I come to the section on literary context. Mr. Johnny, you remember we talked about that a few moments ago, right?
Yes, sir.
All right. And then move on down. Form, structure, and movement. The form of the book of Acts is understood to be prose narrative, historical account of the early church. However, William Willimon notes one should not read Acts as objective, dispassionate reporting of facts sense of history. Thinking about Luke's work as history defined by the modern standards of writing a historical account would be a mistake. Luke wrote his account based on the historical conventions of his day. In the 2nd century treatise on how to write history, Lucian advised historians to give their audiences, quote, what would interest and instruct them. And as a Hellenist, Luke offers a, quote, book of frenetic actions amid a constantly shifting scene of conspiracy, intrigue, ambush, hostile confrontation, fierce conflicts and death, rioting and lynch mobs, personal violence, incessant travel on an Odysseus-like scale all over the Mediterranean world, complete with shipwreck and venomous serpent bites, chains and imprisonments. Now, doesn't that spike your curiosity and make you want to read it?
Yeah.
You know, Luke was really good at telling his history in a way that would engage his audience. His audience would want to read it. That's what my point was there, okay?
Yeah.
So that's formal analysis, and it starts to talk about all the different things in literary fashion. Literary fashion, Luke highlighted several logical, constitutive elements that are necessary to be faithful followers of Christ. Strive for unity, fill with the Spirit, proclaim the gospel, seek grace in the eyes of all people, signs and wonders that follow, and all of that. Now we're down to detailed analysis, which is why I brought this paper up to begin with, and I want to show you this. Notice what I've done here as far as a word search or a word definitions of words. A proper interpretation of this passage must take into account the key terms. Some of the most important terms, even though their meaning is pretty straightforward, are as follows. Fear, or in Greek, it's phobos. Now, Johnny, you were asking a while ago, do you have to put the Greek? You don't have to, but you see I did, right?
Yes, sir.
And
Right.
notice every definition, what I have, a footnote, right? Got this from Walter Bauer's Greek-English Lexicon of the New Testament and other early Christian literature. And I got most of them from that same one because, again, it's a good it is something that everybody in the industry could agree is good definitions of these words. Koinonia was one of my most important words, so I had to look that word up. This term means common or communal. In the context, it's best to translate it as holding all things in communal possession. This word is very important to the understanding of this passage of Scripture. Okay. Having clarified some of the key terms, let's now turn to the meaning of the passage in general. Luke illustrated in Acts chapter 2 that the early Christian church really believed that they were eschatological ramifications to the kingdom work of Jesus, and that meant life as normal had to change. There is an intertextuality, an undercurrent or an allusion of one's, if one will, to the historic faith of Israel as well as daily life with Jesus woven through the Gospel of Luke's and Acts. Now, intertextuality, y'all remember what that word means? We said that it's the same thing mentioned in this passage that's mentioned somewhere else in the Bible, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when you're looking for intertextuality, you're asking, is what I'm reading in this passage, is it anywhere else in the Bible? And if so, did the other person copy this text or did this text copy the other person's text? Well, what I'm suggesting is what Jesus taught the disciples and what Luke is writing in Acts chapter 2, it is an intertextuality of the Old Testament. And a lot of the stuff in the Old Testament is how people were told to live. And then I go back and I reaffirm what I've said above, that Luke, the author of Luke Acts, or Acts in this case, has a firm grasp on the concept of communal existence of God's people because he knows the Old Testament. He knows the Scripture, right?
Right.
So in chapter 4 of Luke, Luke recalls Jesus' inaugural sermon, good news to the poor and release to the captive, the very definition of Jesus' mission. Many scholars have noted that this is an allusion to the Jubilee from Leviticus chapter 25. You see how I'm talking about intertextuality here? And Luke is playing with that intertextuality. He's saying that Jesus said all these things because Moses had said them in Deuteronomy and Leviticus and all these other places. Okay? So again, this is just every jot and every tittle, every sentence and everything, right? Like I said, I'm not going to read you the whole thing. I don't want to bore you to death. But notice what I've done in the bold. I've taken these important words or those important phrases and I've highlighted them and I've said something about those based on my thesis to try to prove my point. Okay? The disciples were also said to have continued the practice of, quote, breaking bread. There have been copious amounts of ink spilled concerning this phrase. Many scholars assert this must be a reflection of the observance of the Lord's Supper. While certainly this is the lion's share of the meaning of this passage, one cannot simply rule out that there is also an intent to assert the communal sharing of the daily concerns of life, such as food. They eat in each other's houses. That's what Luke says in Acts chapter 2, right? And lastly, the disciples continued in prayer with one another. So you see how I went through and I unpacked every section of the most important parts of my passage. They continued in the temple. They continued in each other's houses, daily in prayer, breaking bread with one another, and teaching the gospel. All these things I went through and I talked about every one of those phrases. That's sort of detailed analysis, right? And how that plays into the larger part of the whole message. All right, let me stop right there real quick before we go into synthesis because I want to ask, is there questions about that? Yeah, Wayne.
Okay, so for our detailed analysis, so would it be a good thing to do to be able to break down our outline that we did in the previous section, bringing that over into helping us breaking down after we go through our actual definitions of words?
Yeah, he takes that. He makes that point. What you're basically doing is almost what you read in a commentary. So you know how when you go to a commentary and you look up, let's say, since we've been using it, let's say Isaiah chapter 7, verses 1 through 15, a commentary at the bottom of the page is going to have Isaiah chapter 7, 1 through 3, and then he's going to give you some commentary on those 3 verses, right? And then it's going to say 7, 4 through 6, and it's going to give you some commentary on those 2 verses. And then 7 through 9. It's going to give you some commentary on that. That's what you're doing in detailed analysis. Just like you're talking about, Wayne, you're taking that structure or that outline that you've already broken down, and you're going through detailed analysis telling about every verse, what you think every verse means. And like I said, if you're going to do a key terms or definition section, you also need to put that definition section probably at the very beginning. Go ahead and define the words up front, and then go through and start unpacking. Any other questions? That's a good question, Wayne. All right, let's talk about synthesis real quick. We'll go back and we're going to, I'm just going to show you the outline of a form of a paper so you know how to sort of outline your papers. We're going to go back and talk some more about detailed analysis and synthesis. We're not through just because we're coming to synthesis. Let me say, this is sort of, a synthesis is pulling everything together. So everything I've said from history, social, cultural, formal analysis, literary analysis, detailed analysis, everything that I've said so far, I'm going to distill it down and bring out the most important things that I've said above in just one last little restating of everything in a very concise way. Does that make sense? All right. So basically, here's what I said. Let's not fail to note that all 4 characteristics above are results of first gladly receiving the gospel message and being baptized to the church. These 4 activities have been viewed by many as 4 separate things, but a case can be made that they are in fact 4 elements that characterize a Christian gathering in the early church, and on the whole, this view is preferable. Thus, these characteristics should be seen as the natural outflow of every life who would accept Christ and the kingdom life. In fact, This seems to be the overarching message of this passage, that the actions of the first century Christians were a witness to what life in God's kingdom should look like. It has been shown that Luke may have been highlighting the Christian example in Acts chapter 2 as the fulfillment of the popular belief in Hellenism espoused by the likes of Pythagoras, Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato, that the ideal existence was that of koinonia. It has also been proved above that Luke was highlighting this community as the fulfillment of the ideal of the Old Testament's teachings on koinonia-type Jubilee economics. Therefore, Luke was illustrating that both the biblical and the Greek pagan ideals of life have both been realized in the church's attempt to honestly embody their faith. This ideal state of life became the very witness which resulted in the church having great grace in the eyes of all the people, and thus served as the catalyst for their evangelistic effort. So what have I done here? I have distilled all the important stuff that I said, and I said a lot of stuff in the pages above. Y'all have already seen that because I've been scrolling through, right? We didn't read the whole thing. You saw how much stuff I said. Said a lot of stuff. But you see how I distilled it down into 2 paragraphs? The synthesis section is basically 2 short paragraphs. This is what I've just got through saying, and this is the most important part of what I've just got through saying. And at this point, what you're saying is this is what the passage that we have been studying meant to the people in the original context that read it. This is what it meant to the community to whom it was written. Does that make sense? That's all you're doing. You're saying in 2 short paragraphs what this passage means in a nutshell to the people to whom it was originally written. This is what it meant. As I interpret this passage, this is what everybody who would have read this in the first century would have gotten out of it. Okay? Now, I'm going to go ahead to next week's lesson to reflection, even though you're not going to do that until next week, just to give you an idea what the last section of your paper is. Reflection, you can change that word if you want to theology, because reflection is the theological looking back on or reflecting on the passage that you have just got through interpreting. So synthesis, if it is, this is what the passage meant for the people to whom it was originally written. Reflection means this is now, in light of what it meant to them in the original context, this is now what it means to the people in my context, in my church, my denomination in 2019, the United States, the Christian church in America, the Christian church in the world, whatever you're trying to prove in your theology. So notice how long my reflection section is. It's not very long at all, is it? 3 paragraphs, maybe 4. Did you notice synthesis was 2 paragraphs? Synthesis was 2 paragraphs. Reflection is 3, maybe 4 paragraphs, right? In fact, it's so short. Let me just share with you what I finally said in my theological reflection on my project when I wrote this paper. There are so many concepts that could be highlighted in a theological reflection of this rich section of Scripture. The majority of those comments must be left for another time. See, I can't say everything I want to say about it because that's not what this paper is about. I'm trying to prove that these disciples were trying to live the authentic Christian faith, and that if we look at that passage and understand what that faith is, we've got to live like that today to be the church, okay? So the majority of those comments must be left for another time. Stanley Hauerwas has said, quote, "A church exists as a story-formed community, and this narrative is much part of that formative story. The fact that the church in Acts exists as the church has always existed, a people who claim to know something that we would not have known except it was given to us, sort of as the gift of revelation," right? What is given to the church in Acts? The commands of Torah for Jubilee, type economic and social relations, the call for a just society of the prophets of Israel, and both the former embodied in the communal life that was most living recently by Jesus and his disciples. What was given to the church today then? We've all been given the rich Old Testament tradition that was given to the church in Acts, the story of the church in Acts itself, and all of the Christian narrative in history from that day until now. So Christian koinonia then is constitutive of what it means to be the church today. It is a natural outgrowth of faith in Christ. If the previous statement is fact, why then does the church often not resemble the example of the church in Acts? There have been, in fact, many historic as well as contemporary examples of attempts to live a vibrant Christian faith or koinonia. However, it is painfully recognized and freely admitted that there are also many examples of the formation of exactly the opposite of the biblical example of Christian community. There is no doubt that a very large part of the body of Christ today lives with no discernible difference socially as compared to the society around us. It should be no surprise then that churches, denominations, movements, and individuals seek to live as Christians without exhibiting koinonia. God's people have always suffered periods and places of unfaithfulness. Indeed, Israel often looked more like their Canaanite neighbors than they did the peaceable kingdom into which God has called us. Nevertheless, unfaithfulness is not the goal. Faithfulness and obedience should be the desire of everyone baptized into the faith of Christ. Jesus did not come bringing an interesting philosophy of life. He came calling people to a new way of living and dying. The stories in Acts not only depict an author, God, not only render a new world, God's world, but they also render a new way of living, discipleship in the church. The Jesus event really does have eschatological implications for the everyday life of those of us called to live for Christ. The pessimistic suggestion of some that koinonia illustrated in Acts was simply, quote, an idealized and romanticized creation of the later church sadly testifies more to the loss of the church's confidence in the ability of the resurrection than to some mystical inability to embody the kingdom life. As a consequence, the church is invited, nay commanded, to trust in the power of the resurrection and pursue with dogged passion an honest attempt to live the faith. Now, do you see what I did there with that last sentence? What's the title of my paper? Anybody remember the title of this paper? An honest attempt to live the faith. See how I brought it 100 degrees back around 180 degrees back around full circle? My closing statement is, this is what God has called us to do. To live like the church in Acts, so much so to the point that we sell our possessions and give it to those in need in the church. How could we possibly own a Lamborghini if there's somebody in our church that don't have electricity in their home? You know, they don't have shoes on their kids' feet. They don't have food on their table to feed their children. I mean, we have to consider, was God calling us to, a Pontiac instead of a Lamborghini so we can make sure they have clothes on their children's back and food on their table? You know what I'm saying? So that's what that whole argument was about all along. So this is what the church, in synthesis, this is what the church believed it to mean to them in their day and time. And in light of that, this is what I'm saying that it means to me and our church, in my opinion, today in our day and time as a theological reflection. That's what reflection is at the time. Does that make sense to everybody? Give me a thumbs up.
Can I?
Okay, I got a couple of thumbs up. Ms. Nyoka, you got a comment?
Yeah, I have a question.
Okay.
So if I was writing my paper, I could say, for instance, stand firm on your faith.
Right.
And then go back later on the end. That would be what I'm trying to tell you, to stand firm.
Yes.
But I have to give the history of then, history of now, how we need to stand strong on our faith.
So, okay, if you're talking about Isaiah chapter 7, verses 1 through 15, Isaiah tells Ahaz to stand firm, right? So that is the central message of that passage. You're exactly right. That's what it meant to them in that day and time. So what you would do in the reflection section is your theological section at the end is you would say, now, in light of what I've said about Isaiah 7, verses 1 through 15, and what it meant to them, here's what it means to the church today. Yes, it still means for us to stand firm, to trust in God. Don't try to take matters into our own hands and make things right when we can't do that, right? There's some things that are just too big to handle. Right, that's exactly right.
Okay.
Okay? Any other questions about
I think I got it.
any other questions about the format of the paper before we continue on talking about, the process still, detailed analysis and synthesis? Okay, if there's not any questions, I'm going to have to ask your permission to just beg your leave for just 1 second. I got a chocolate lab who is at the door barking, wanting to come in, and he's going to stand there and bark and bother our class until I let him in. So hold on just a second. Come on, gotta get on your blanket. Get up. Up. Get up. Good boy. He found his place. Y'all see him in the background back there, right? All right. So let's keep looking at some more of these questions real quick on the detailed analysis section. I'll send y'all that paper, by the way, a little bit later tonight after we close out class and make sure everybody has a copy of it. Okay. So let me just read through these questions fairly quickly because we're not going to go through every one of them. But now I want you to notice that there's some redundancy. We've already done some things that he's going to ask us to do in this paper or in this section. But the reason he asks us to do it again, he calls this the hermeneutical circle. He says, so as you're doing interpretation, you'll constantly do some things over and over again. You'll ask some of the same questions. And the reason why you do that is it's just like when you have a diamond. Y'all have heard of how a diamond is multifaceted. It means it's got cuts and angles on it in different directions. If you hold it up to the light in one way and you look at it, and then you turn it and you look at it in the same way from a different angle, sometimes you see something you didn't see before, right? So color, clarity, cut, all the things that a diamond or jeweler is looking for in a diamond. Same thing's true with the Bible. You go at it with the formal analysis and you ask questions about literary, simile, metaphor, personification, all the things we talked about before. You get to the detailed analysis section, he's asking you to ask some of those same questions again, but what he's doing, he's asking you to ask it now after you've gone maybe a week from having done that before, and now you're asking those questions again. You might see something now you didn't see then. Does that make sense? So what I'm trying to say is don't spend, 100 hours on, literary devices again this week if you spent, 50 hours on it last week. Sometimes you might just ask the question and look at it and say, you know what, I really don't see anything new. I did that last week, and just move on. Okay, so that's the next question that he asks after the key terms. Are there literary or rhetorical devices that are used? Simile, metaphor, hyperbole, personification, repetition, irony, etc. Well, all of those things would have already been dealt with if you did a good literary analysis and a good structural analysis under formal analysis. Does that make sense? You should have already picked up on any repetitions when you did an outline for the structure of your passage. So, Wayne, you were talking a moment ago about where we put our breaks in our outline at. I did 5, you did another one, maybe 6 or whatever. But one of the good things about outlining a passage like that, after you've outlined it, you begin to see things you didn't see before. There was a girl in the class at the traditional class that I'm teaching at the main campus. She's doing Psalm 47, I believe it is. And she outlined her passage. And once she outlined it, me and her both recognized something she had not seen and I really hadn't seen before. But it was a repetition. It kept saying something about trust God, trust God, trust God, trust God. Right? And as you're reading through it, it's far enough apart that you don't necessarily catch it immediately. But when she outlined it, she broke it apart. Like in each section, right at the end of that section, it said, now trust God. Right? So then she saw that in the structure, there was a repetition. So part of her structural analysis was that there's repetition. Well, if she goes here and asks the question, is there repetition? Well, yeah, she already knows the answer to that, right? Yes, there's repetition. Trust God, trust God, trust God, trust God. Okay? So just be mindful of that. Also, don't forget hyperbole. Mr. Johnny, you were asking a moment ago about the rhetorical devices. I mentioned simile, metaphor, and personification. Well, hyperbole is one too. And for those of you who don't know what hyperbole is, let me just remind you from grammar school, back in high school and literature class, hyperbole is making a statement that is so blatantly crazy sounding that it's meant to jar you, right? So a point of hyperbole in the New Testament would be when Jesus says, don't worry about the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye when you got a light pole hanging out of yours, right? There's no way to really have a light pole hanging out of your eye, but what he says, there's a log sticking out of your own eye, and you're trying to get the splinter out of your friend's eye, right? That's a hyperbolic statement, and it's exaggerated on that scale for the point of making a purpose. The sin in your life might be a lot larger than the little sin you're trying to correct in your brother or sister's life. Get your own life cleaned up first. So be looking for hyperbole, because that's a way that the author uses literarily to make a point. All right, what kind of sentences are used? What are the major components of the sentences? What are the verbal actions? When it says what kind of sentences, it's talking about questions, declarations, exclamations, right? The different types of words that are, or sentences that are used would make a difference, wouldn't it? So if the author of the Bible text is constantly asking a question, well, then they're interrogatives, right? And they're not making a declaration. If they're declarative statements, then they're making a declaration. He's making an assertion. That would make a difference in how the passage comes across. What are the verbal actions or states that appear in the sentences, and what subjects are associated with them? Who's supposed to be doing the work of the sentence when the sentence says, you know, the verbal action is the work to be done? A good example of verbal action is, y'all have heard of the you understood in grammar. So like someone can say, shut the door, right? There's no subject in that sentence, but the you, because you are the subject, right, that the person is talking to, when they're talking to you, you shut the door, right? So you're the subject, shut the door is the verbal action, and you're being asked to do it. And if you want to see a little bit of what he's talking about when he says that, let's see if I can find it. On page 113, we'll just flip ahead to page 113. He talks about you can break the sentences down if you want to go this deep in your research. And you can say, what is the text phrase, or what is the sentence? Break the sentence down in phrases and ask, what is the meaning and function of it? So you see how he says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, in that little box. In the beginning is an adverbial phrase indicating a time of the action. When did this happen? In the beginning. God created. Who? God. God is the subject. Created, what does that mean? That is the action verb, right? God actually created the verb. And then what was created? The indirect object or the direct object? The two objects of this are the heavens and the earth. They're direct objects. This is actually what happened to them, right? God created them. So you can break it down just like in grammar class. Back when I was in grammar class, they used to have these long things on the board that was like a line, and it had these little angled lines coming off the side. You had to diagram sentences with the verb, the adverb, the adjective, the indirect object, the direct object, the subject. Y'all remember diagramming sentences back in the day? Yeah, Jeff remembers it. And Johnny. That's what he's doing here, diagramming sentences to be able to break down the meaning of what is the sentence trying to communicate. I won't read over again all these questions, but just note, does the text use sources? Where do the sources come from if they do? What is the elements of narrative, like setting, plot, conflict, character development? What is the tone or the mood? What is how does each part contribute to the whole, and all that stuff? All right, let me just stop right there because I want to make sure we've got everybody's on board before we talk about meaning and context and move on with the rest of this chapter. But you kind of see some of the main questions that you need to be asking for detailed analysis. Okay. All right, 2 thumbs up. Everybody else good? All right. Miss Nyoko, are you froze? I think her screen is froze right now. Okay, it looks like she's back, maybe. Maybe it's a little bit slow and draggy. The internet's slow and draggy a little bit. All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about then is meaning in context. When you're trying to do your detailed analysis, what is the context of the actual sentence or the words in the sentence? He gives a good illustration The exclamation, and this is right under meaning and context in your textbook on page 106. If you see the first paragraph there, the meaning of the exclamation, "Oh my God," has one meaning in the context of prayer, right? If you're praying, you say, "Oh my God, please hear my prayer," right? It has another meaning in the context of admiring someone's new car. OMG. You know, people use the OMG. I'm not too particularly fond of that, but they do it today. Same thing with the word fire, right? It depends on where you say that word. You could be saying, "Boy, it's really cold outside. It's nice that we got a warm fire." That means one thing, right? Or if you're in a movie theater and you just say, "Fire," that's illegal if there's not really a fire, right? You're not supposed to do that. Or it could be 3, 2, 1, fire, right? Like a shooting, somebody's getting ready to get shot in a firing squad. Right? Ready, aim, fire, right? So wherever you say the word fire, it depends on the context in which it is a part of that you actually find the meaning of it. And so he talks about that when he says that there are lexical senses or lexical meanings of words in the dictionary. When you go look up a word, that word may or may not mean what it means in the dictionary in the context of the passage you're reading it. Does that make sense? So what he wants to make sure we understand is that we don't make a couple of mistakes that some people make when they're doing biblical exegesis. So look at page 108. When you're doing the definitions of these words and you're trying to figure out what it means in context, make sure you avoid what's called illegitimate totality transfer. You see that written in italic? In the first paragraph under further principles for analysis of words. Now, what does that mean? Illegitimate totality transfer. It means taking a definition of a word, because you know if you go to like Webster's and there's a word, it's got like 5 different definitions. Like definition 1, it means this, and definition 2, it sort of means this, and they all kind of mean a little bit the same, but there's a little bit of difference to them too. You can't take all 5 of those words and bring it across in your exegetical paper and say, this is what Paul means. He means all 5 of these things, because that's what it means in the dictionary. Paul usually means one of those 5 things, right? James might be using the same word. He might mean something totally else. And I'll give you a good example of what he means when he says that. The word faith, right? When Paul was speaking about faith, he's talking about trusting in God without any evidence of any works. And most of the time you hear Paul saying stuff like, we're saved by grace through faith, that not of ourselves is a gift of God, not of works, lest anybody boast, and all that, right? But what does James say when he uses the word faith? If you can somehow possibly show me your faith without works, that'd be amazing. But I'm not even going to try to show you mine outside of my works, right? So for James, faith is defined by if you have faith in grace, yeah, you're not being saved by works. But if you got it, then you will have the works after you got it, right? And I think Paul would say the same thing, but there is a little bit of a nuance of difference if you notice it, right? So if you go look up the word faith, there's going to be probably a couple different definitions. What one does Paul normally use? What one does James normally use? And where are you reading your passage from? Don't take all the meanings of the word faith and bring them all across and say they all mean this in this passage, because they probably don't. In this passage, they mean one of those 5 things, okay? That is the fallacy of illegitimate totality transfer. There's another one that he gives you right below that. It's called the etymological fallacy. Etymology means where a word comes from, how the word first came into our lexicon and why we started using it, who made it up, right? So the word he uses is enthusiasm as an example. The word enthusiasm is from the Greek en, which is a prefix meaning in, at least en, but it means in, like inside of, theos, which means God. So back in the day when that word enthusiastic first came out, It was from two Greek, or a Greek word and a prefix sort of slammed together. Antheos, enthusiasm. So if you were acting all out of yourself, it meant you were caught up in God, like when you were speaking in tongues in Acts, right? So at that point, the word enthusiasm was connected to a particular set of actions, how people act, like they're acting sort of crazy. They must be in God. They caught up in the Spirit. Well, what about if you use today in the statement that an atheist was at a baseball game for his child at Little League, and his child hit a home run, and he became ever so enthusiastic? Well, you can't really say that an atheist is caught up in the Spirit of God because he don't believe in God. But today, the word don't mean what it did mean, right? It has shifted in its contextual definition or its connotation. Okay, does that make sense? Let me give you another example. Bad. If we went back into 1956 in the sock hop era, and somebody rolled up in an old car, and everybody looked at that car and said, "Man, where'd you get that bad car from?" What would they mean? That's a jalopy, right? A lemon. That thing is broke down, busted, disgusted, and can't be trusted to even carry you from here to there. But if somebody rolled up today in a 57 Chevy with the mag wheels and nice paint job, and they got the sock hop music playing, and somebody standing around and said, "Man, that car sure is bad," what would they mean today? That they would say that means that car is good, right? The same exact word means exactly the opposite today than it did back then. Michael Jackson even wrote a song about it, right? Who's bad? He wasn't trying to say he was bad. He was trying to say he was good, right? So the lexical meaning of a word is not always the meaning in context. So be careful to make sure you seek the word's meaning in context. And to that sense, he talks about on page 109 the difference between connotation and figurative language and denotation. The denotation is the definition of the word if you go to the dictionary. The connotation is what does it mean in its context? Okay, it means a little something differently. And figurative language, we all know what figurative language is, right? Like I said, using metaphor, using simile, something to symbolize something else that's not meant to be taken literally. So a figurative example may be in the New Testament book of Revelation. John says, "I was standing on the seashore and I saw a 7-headed beast rise up out of the ocean, and on its head it had crowns and horns and, names of blasphemy on its horns and heads and crowns." He probably did not see like a 7-headed hydra literally, right? What is he doing? He's making a figurative analogy to a hydra, a 7-headed beast in Greek mythology, to the Roman government. And he's saying that the government of Rome is like that 7-headed beast. If you cut one head off, 7 heads come back in its place. It's almost impossible to kill it. And its heads have got crowns, and its heads have got blasphemous names right on it. Well, those are the Caesars who say that they're Lord God and they're blaspheming God, right? So you got to find in the figurative language the symbolism of what the author is trying to get across. Does that make sense? All this is sort of under that detailed analysis. We're going verse by verse and looking at how does the parts of it all play into the whole, the meaning of the whole. Okay? All right. He also talks about explicit and implicit relationships in the text. Let's look at explicit relationships first. There's 2 of them that he talks about. Narrative or time, and then logic. Okay? So look on page 115, and this is the narrative or the time chronological explicit relationships. Under chronological explicit relationships, you've got key words that help you to see when this particular passage is actually being talked about. While, when, before, then, next, after this, when, then, therefore, on Zion, location, and on the third day, time and action, right? So you see each one of these? So the one that helps you to see simultaneous action is while and when. So what's a good example of that? Jesus is having disciples for the Last Supper. He's having his disciples up in the upper room for the Last Supper. Judas decides to betray Jesus. Jesus is betrayed by Jesus says to Judas, what you got to do, you got to do it quickly because, you know, it's bad what you're getting ready to do. Judas goes out to go do it. While Judas was going to betray Jesus, Jesus was washing the disciples' feet, right? So if the passage says while this was happening, this was also happening. That indicates simultaneous action, right? Jesus is washing the disciples' feet. Judas is out betraying him at the same time. Two stories going on at the same time, two different locations. Does that make sense? That's the explicit relationship of those two stories if you were reading that particular text. Before, it's the same way. Before Jesus came to Nazareth, he was over here doing such and so over there, right? This is what he was doing before. Well, now he's over here in Nazareth. And you can go through and pick out the rest of those. I don't want to, I'm not trying to be pedantic and talk down to you. I think you can read. But I just want to make sure you have examples of some of these. The next explicit connection is the form or logic. Condition is if and then. So if you got a statement as a if then clause, that's what's called in technical terms, it's a protasis and an apodosis. The protasis is the if statement, the apodosis is the then statement, and it makes a connection, a logical connection. Let me give you an example of where that happens at. In the Old Testament, Jacob has had his experience with God watching the ladder or the staircase that's up and down from heaven, and he sees the angels coming up and down in the dream at night, right? He wakes up the next day and he says, oh my gosh, I must be in God's house. I'm going to change the name of this place to Bethel, house of God. And then he sets up an altar and he pours oil on it and he prays to God and he says, God, I perceive that you are in this place and that you're with me. You're the God of my fathers, my ancestors, and I trust that you're going to go with me and bless me as I go, into this place looking for a wife. He's going to Laban's house, as we know. And then Jacob says something that would be a little bit difficult for us as Christians to hear today. He says, if you will go with me and bless me, then when I come back to this land, I will pay you tithes of all the blessings that you've given to me. Well, we would say today in the church, you don't wait to see how God blesses you before you tithe, right? You go ahead and on faith, you step out and you tithe and you trust God and then you let God work it out. But that's not what Jacob did. He said, if, then, right? So that's exegetically significant when you're actually working on that passage of Scripture. There is an explicit relationship between his trust in God and his willingness to be obedient to God. And the explicit relationship is a conditional one, as it says here in the book. If then is conditional. Also, he talks about reason. Because, if you see the key word because in your passage, then you know that the reason why the next statement that's coming is because of what was just before, right? This is done because of so-and-so. And purpose, result, or consequence, and all these other ones. So these are explicit relationships in the text. Any questions or comments about that before we talk about implicit ones? Everybody got a thumbs up? I hope I'm just that good of a teacher. I'm just making it that clear. So I hope your eyes aren't glazing over and you're just saying, okay, I've just tuned out a long time ago.
But that's talking about these right here, though.
Yes, the explicit relationships, right. You can find them in your book. I mean, like I said, I'm here as more of a guide on the side, not a sage on the stage. I'm not up here telling you what to believe. I'm telling you how to find the information in the passage so you can work it out. So let's look at implicit then. If explicit is the text tells us exactly what we need to know about the relationships, whether they be temporal or logical relationships. The implicit ones are just like they sound, implied, not given to us freely. The text doesn't give us the information. So I'll just give you one. Nicodemus comes to Jesus by night, according to John's gospel. What does that imply to you as you read that passage?
He was being secretive,
Exactly.
trying to keep it from the other Pharisees.
When something is done at night, you're trying to hide it. It's something you're not willing to stick your neck out on the line. John's gospel could have said, Nicodemus came to Jesus at night because he was scared of what everybody would think. If he did that, that word because would let us know there's an explicit relationship between why he did what he did. And we go back and say, the explicit relationship tells us right in the text why he came at night. This is an implied relationship. We know he came at night. The author is implying because he was afraid or scared or ashamed, right? But you get that. You get it as a reader because it's so clear in the implication. You almost can't miss it. Another one that is implied that he gives you in the text on page 115 at the bottom. The last sentence of the second to the last paragraph. Y'all see that? The Pauline acclamation, Jesus is Lord, for example, means that Paul is not Lord, Caesar is not Lord, and so on, right? So what Paul doesn't do in the New Testament and say, Caesar says he's Lord, but he's not really. Jesus is, right? All Paul has to do is say Jesus is Lord, and in the first century, everybody would have heard that means that Caesar's not. So for us today, when we're doing the exegesis of a passage where Paul is talking about Jesus being Lord, we really have to bring that explicit relationship out to the congregation, because today we are so far removed of a political leader, thankfully for the most part, saying that he's God and that you have to trust him and believe him, that we don't get that same sense that if you say somebody's God, then you're saying somebody else is not God, right? We hear people say Jesus is Lord all the time today. It doesn't have any political connections whatsoever. In the first century, it did. So you got to help bring that out to your audience when you're preaching, right? You got to tell them this would have been a highly treasonous thing to say in the first century. It could have got you thrown in jail. It could have got you thrown to the lions. It usually did get Christians killed when they didn't say Caesar is Lord. All right. Any other questions about that before we talk about some of the criticisms of what he's going to tell you to also look for in this detailed analysis section?
Is there any reference guide I know you said scholar at Mount Olive. Is there any certain one that would be good to use with your detailed analysis?
Look in, this is something I don't know if I've actually made a point to show to y'all. Turn to page 209 in the pack of your book. (209), 210, 211, 212, 213, 214, 215, 216, 217, 218, 19, 220, 221, 222, 223, 224, 225. Oh, excuse me, I went too far. It stops on 224. Actually on 225, about midway down the page. Now, from 209 to 224, you see all those resources listed for you in bibliographic form? Every one of those resources are a resource to help you with specifically detailed analysis. If you back up, you will see there's a resource for contextual analysis section. There is a resource section for formal analysis. After the detailed analysis, there's a resource section for synthesis. Then after that, there's a resource section for theological interpretation. This is a really, really good textbook for doing exegesis, because Mr. Gorman has taught exegesis for many, many years, and he's put together a bibliographic, basically a cheat sheet for any of his students to use. All you got to do is go to the back of your textbook and look up whatever section it is you're doing. And you say, you know what, I'd really like to have some really good scholarly resources for detailed analysis. Look right here. There's a whole bunch of them. All you got to do then is just go to the library or go online, wherever you can find them at. You might can find some of these at Amazon for $1 a piece or $2 a piece. Some of them are older, and they'll be cheap. You know, you can find them for $4 or $5. It might cost you more shipping unless you got Amazon Prime than the actual book itself will cost you. And if you look at Mr. Johnny, if y'all can all look at Johnny on the screen, Johnny, just move over to the other way. Just lean, there you go, lean that way. Look right there behind Mr. Johnny. That's what a good pastor will do eventually. Work to build up your library. Every time you get a chance, buy some commentaries, buy some Bible dictionaries, buy some commentary or some concordances, some Hebrew and Greek grammars and things like that. Put them on your shelf, put them in your library, and then that way when you're doing this work, you got all those resources right there in your home. You ain't got to go anywhere. All right, does that answer your question, Jeff? All right.
I've got a introduction to the New Testament. Could you use that too?
Yeah, introduction to the New and introduction to the Old Testament books are really good. The ones you have for class in here, the Coogan text, the Powell text, they're good. There's another couple of books that you could use if you had the Life and Teachings of Jesus class. They had Mark Allen Powell that did the New Testament intro book for the one that we use here. He also has another book for the Life and Teachings of Jesus class we use. That's a good book for doing biblical research for exegesis. So, yeah, any of those books would be good.
Thank you.
Yep. And remember the Hebrew prophets book that we used, the Newsom book? If you need to draw from that from an Old Testament passage, that's a good book to use for Old Testament. Get some good historical, cultural, social, some good theology, all that stuff out of that. Okay? While you're already at the back of the book, I'm going to go ahead and show you something else real quick that you may not have noticed. Two things. Look at page 241 right quick. It gives you a practical guideline for writing a research exegesis paper. Since we had not got to the point of writing the paper yet, I hadn't illustrated this to you. I want to go ahead and show you this tonight. I was going to show it to you later at the end of class, but since we're already back here, look at it. That gives you step-by-step kind of from page 241 to 246, kind of gives you a step-by-step work on how to work through writing a paper. Look right after 246. Are you there at 246 yet? Look, what does it say? 3 sample exegesis papers. He gives you a short one, a medium-sized one, a longer one on page 252, and then a longer one on the next page of 264, page 264. It would literally take you about 30 minutes to read through all 3 of those exegesis papers at the back of this book. And you can see how each one of those formulated their paper, how they did an introduction with a thesis statement, and then went into contextual, historical, social, formal, detailed, synthesis, reflection, and conclusion, right? Just go through and read those papers and just take note of them, of how they formulated their paper, and it'll help you when you do your paper. These are 3 students that Mr. Gorman had in his class that he thought their exegesis papers were good enough that he could include them in his book. So he just shared his students' work with you and me. And there was one more thing I was going to show you if I can find it. See if look at chapter 10 on page 175. Exegesis and the exegete. Errors to avoid, discoveries to make. And if you look at it, it's going to give you basically this whole book in paragraph form. Every chapter that we've done so far. The chapter 1, the task, a paragraph. Chapter 2, the text, a paragraph. Chapter 3, the element number 1, survey, a paragraph. Number 2, element 2, a paragraph. And basically he just tells you what you should be doing and what you should avoid doing when you do these sections, right? And it goes through all the way through to the end. So don't be hesitant to use chapter 10 through the end of the book and the appendices to help you get a grasp on what we're doing in this class. Okay? All right, back to where we were. Let me make sure where I was. Okay. Page 116 and 117. So most of us are not skilled enough to be able to do the level of biblical criticism that is done in most seminaries and places, like from professors, people who are writing textbooks. Source criticism, form criticism, tradition criticism, and redaction criticism are all listed here for you. Y'all know what those are because you've taken the Old Testament intro class, or we've talked about them in some of the classes we've been in. But just by just a quick recount, source criticism is trying to see if there's any sources that your author used to put together the passage you're reading. So if you're reading from the Gospel of Matthew, if you've taken the New Testament class, you know that the theory is that Mark was written first, and that there's probably a document called Q that we no longer have access to today, but that probably Matthew and Luke had access to. And when they wrote their Gospels, they were using Mark and Q. And so you're asking, does Matthew draw this passage that I'm reading from Q, from Mark, or is it unique to the Gospel of Matthew, right? Where's the source of it? That's source criticism. Form criticism is asking what type of story this is. What is the form of the story? And how is that form generally used to actually transfer meaning? So like a knock-knock joke has a specific form. We talked about this last week, if y'all remember. I said knock-knock, y'all said who's there. I said, how do you know to say who's there? Because that's the way that the form has been used over the years, right? So how has parables been used over the years? Form critics look at parables in the form of a parable and say, this is why a parable is constructed in the way that it is. Tradition criticism is like, how has this passage been passed down through the tradition? Has it been tweaked and changed over the time? And that even gets into the next one, which is redaction criticism. And redaction criticism is the one he does say that even those of us at our level can probably do some measure of. We might not do the other higher criticisms, but redaction criticism is pretty easy because it's editing. The word redaction is a big word for editing. So how has the passage that I'm reading today, how has it been edited from the last time it was written, right? And so you can do that if you find an intertextuality, because let's say, well, let me give you an example of one. So Paul is writing in Galatians, and he says the disciples all met together in Jerusalem, and they all decided that Paul should go to the Gentiles and Peter should stay with the Jews, and they should all preach Jesus to the Jews and to the Gentiles. And that when Paul went to the Gentiles, that all he had to do was to remember the poor, and there was one other thing, I can't remember what he said. And that's all that they told me I had to do, Paul said, right? But if you go back to Acts and you read the original time when they recounted what actually happened in Acts chapter 15, I believe it is, at the Jerusalem Council, they said, okay, yes, go to the Gentiles, but when you do, make sure that you avoid sexual immorality, avoid eating certain meats like strangled meats, and don't eat blood. Make sure it's kosher, butchered, kosher, and remember the poor and all of that stuff, right? So why does Paul in Galatians purposely leave out the sexual fornication and the don't eat certain types of meats, or don't make sure you don't eat the blood? Because that was clearly in the first recounting of what they decided at the Jerusalem Council. But in Galatians, Paul sort of leaves that out. That's an editorial remark, right? That's an editorial move to leave that out. It might be strategic. So why do you think Paul might have left it out? Well, if he left it out on purpose and it's just not slipped his memory, he might have left it out on purpose because the whole argument at Galatia is do we need to get circumcised, and do we need to keep certain feasts, and do we need to eat certain types of meats to be like the Jews so we can also be Christians? Right? And Paul has been saying at Galatia the whole time, no, you don't have to get circumcised, you don't have to eat certain meats, you don't have to keep Sabbath and all of those things. Those are things that the Jews do, but you as Gentiles, you don't have to do those things to come into the covenant. You just accept Jesus, trust in him, no works-based salvation, right? He's trying to get these people away from this idea of works-based salvation. So when he recounts what they said at Jerusalem at the council, he might have just sort of left that one part off about eating certain meats and not being, all these things, because it sounds like some works you got to do, right? And that would undercut what he's been trying to do at Galatia all along by telling them you don't have to do certain things to be saved. You get what I'm saying? All right, any questions about that? Does that makes sense, right? Editorial or redaction criticism. How has my text been redacted or edited, and why? Is there a reason? All right. Another example. Let me give you an easier example probably. So in Mark's gospel, Jesus goes into a town and the people don't have a lot of faith in Jesus. And it says there Jesus could do no miracle. Matthew tells that same story later, and he's using Mark probably to tell the story, but he edits the text. And Matthew says Jesus went into this town, these people didn't have a lot of faith in him, and there Jesus chose to do no miracle. Do you see the edit that just took place? Mark said Jesus couldn't do a miracle because of the lack of people's faith. Matthew says Jesus just chose not to do one because of the lack of their faith. Matthew's had time to reflect on what it sounds like that Mark is saying. It sounds like there's something Jesus can't do. And if Jesus is God in the flesh, what can he not do? Nothing, right? So that's why Matthew sort of softens that rhetoric and changes that wording. It's not that Jesus couldn't do the miracle. He just chose not to because y'all won't believe. Do you see the reason for doing redaction criticism or editorial work? All right, let me stop there and say if there's any questions, comments, or concerns, we'll go ahead and unpack them now before we move on.
Just
All right.
using that.
Okay, go ahead, Johnny.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Go ahead.
Just using that analogy you just did right there, is it safe to say that the disciples, when they was writing, when they like Jesus was healing, and Matthew maybe looked away, and when he came back, he saw him doing the laying of the hands, but say Mark saw him just speak the word.
Well, if you remember, so the most academic scholarship points to the fact that both Matthew and Mark probably didn't see Jesus doing these things.
Right.
So Mark was the translator for Peter when Peter was preaching in Rome. John Mark was with Peter, and they believe it's probably the Mark that wrote Mark, right? So he probably wrote it very early, which is in the 60s, but that's still 30 years after Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. And Mark probably didn't actually see him because he wasn't one of the original 12, but he heard Peter telling the story. So Mark's writing the story that Peter's preaching. So while he's translating for Peter, he's writing down what Peter was saying. He's probably writing the gospel that way. Well, Matthew, it's traditionally the book is ascribed to Matthew, but nowhere in the book does it say Matthew actually wrote the book.
Correct.
And the fact is, they don't believe Matthew did, because Matthew was one of Jesus' original disciples. And the argument is, if Matthew used Q and Mark to write his gospel, why would he have had to do that if he was actually there and saw it himself, an eyewitness? So whoever's writing the book of Matthew was probably not also privy to seeing Jesus. But again, they're writing in 70 AD around about, that's 30, 40 years after Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. I mean, that's as old as most of us are, right? I mean, I'm 47. So we're talking about from the time I was born till today, difference between when Matthew was written and Jesus actually walked the earth. You're talking an entire generation away. but by that time, they have had time to theologically reflect on who Jesus was. And those disciples who were asking Jesus stuff like, what manner of man are you that winds and waves? They were
Right.
They couldn't believe what they were seeing. The communities had 40 years to unpack that. Now they've said Jesus is Lord for the longest time, since Paul said it back in the 50s, right? Paul was preaching Jesus was Lord in the 50s. So, yeah, I don't think it's as simple as one just saw it one way and one saw it the other way. It's one is writing with
Writing for
a set of one is writing with a set of sources to be able to make his paper or his gospel, and the other is writing with that source as well as another source and his own source material. So it's very complicated. I mean, when you start doing biblical research, you got to get into parsing out who wrote it and where was it written from and to whom, about what year time, and all that kind of stuff. So does that help, Johnny?
Yes, sir.
Okay. But again, that gets back to, by the time Matthew's writing, he's writing from Mark, and he's redacting, he's changing, he's editing. And the reason he's editing is because Mark had made it sound like, and Mark didn't intend to make it sound this way. He just said there Jesus could do no miracle because of their lack of faith.
Right.
He didn't mean to say he couldn't do it esoterically or essentially. That makes it sound like Jesus isn't really God, right?
Right.
All right. So intertextuality, he asked about that on page 119 and 120. So where is this text used in the Bible and other places? That's important. And like I said before, how is it tweaked or changed, or has it been tweaked or changed from the last time it was used? And sometimes it's not been tweaked or changed at all, but it's still important to know where it comes from. Like Jesus is talking in Luke chapter 4, and he says, the Spirit of the Lord God is upon me. He's anointed me to preach good news to the poor, release of the captives, the recovery of sight of the blind, the healing of the lame, and all these things. And by the way, this is fulfilled in your hearing today. Well, we know that passage comes from what? Isaiah chapter 61, I think it is. So we want to go back and find out what was Isaiah chapter 61 trying to say, because Jesus is quoting it and saying that it's now come to full circle. It's come to full fruition. So we got to know what it meant in Isaiah. When we go back to Isaiah, we find out that Isaiah is talking about the Jubilee, which comes where? From Leviticus chapter 25. So you see how this one theme has been used in 3 different sections of the Bible. The very first section, Leviticus, the Torah, now in the prophets in the middle in Isaiah, and again, Jesus is quoting it a 3rd time. So it's been used intertextually several times throughout Israel's history. And so you kind of trace that down and say, okay, now I understand what Jesus' ministry was. Because I go back to Leviticus chapter 25, and it says in Leviticus chapter 25, release all captives, anybody who's in debt prison. Release all debts, anybody who's in debt. All that goes to zero. We reset the whole economy. Those who are greedy and blind spiritually, help them to learn how to see, right? So recovery of sight to the blind people to see that this is what God has wanted us to do, this Jubilee type lifestyle. So Jesus basically founds his ministry on Jubilee. But you wouldn't know that unless you did the work through the Bible and its intertextuality, like everywhere it's actually mentioned in the Bible, tracing it back to its origin. Does that make sense? I know this sounds like a lot of work, and it kind of is a lot of work. Ministry is a lot of work. Doing biblical study is a lot of work. A lot of people say, well, preacher, I know you only work 1 day a week, so what do you do for the rest of the week? Come to the study and we'll show you. If you want to get down and dirty and get nitty gritty, we'll show you how much work it is to pore over scriptures, and then somehow still have to try to figure out how to be at the wedding rehearsal, go to the nursing home, the hospital, be a good mama or daddy, a husband or a wife, a son or a daughter, a grandchild to your grandparents. I mean, we still have all the same responsibilities everybody else does, but we still got to do all this work. So don't ever think that the gospel is is a call to ease, because it's not.
And your time belongs to the people.
Exactly. Now, Page 121 gives us the last section on the detailed analysis, and that is narrative criticism. Narrative criticism is sort of new in biblical studies, and it's really intriguing. It is more literary, like informal, but this time we're going to focus mainly on the narrative itself as far as character and characterization, character development, that kind of thing. So on page 122, he talks about how a narrative moves in structure with the introduction, the rising action, the development, conflict, climax, falling action. We've already talked about that in the formal analysis. We're not going to talk about that again. But here he wants you to do this. Ask, who are the characters in the story? How are they developed throughout the description, their actions? What are their roles in history? Is a character a protagonist, that is, a leading character? Are they an antagonist, an opponent to the leading character? Or are they a supporting character? And you can think about stories in the Old Testament as illustrating this really good. If you want to go do an exegesis of the story of Joseph. Now, who is Joseph in the story? Antagonist, protagonist, or just a supporting character? Joseph seems to be the protagonist, right? He's the main character. Who is the antagonists? And they're plural.
The brothers.
All the brothers. They hate his guts. They are jealous of him. They want to sell him into slavery. They want to kill him, but they're scared to kill him, so they decide to sell him. They sell him into slavery, right?
Yes.
And who is sort of a tangential character in that story?
Couldn't it be too his father as well as the
Yep.
Finna say the priest, the king that put him in that put him in.
Oh
jail.
yeah, Potiphar and then Pharaoh eventually. So yeah, some of those guys are supporting characters to the story, right? But you got a protagonist, you got antagonist plural, and you got some supporting characters. And then you could talk about how those characters are developed. How are characters developed? Usually it's the actions that we take, right? So certain actions develop a certain way. So how is Joseph developed as a character? Well, he begins as a spoiled brat, if you think about it. I mean, he's been doted on. He's gotten all the best things from his father. And then he has this dream that God basically tells him in the dream he's going to be the greatest of all of them. And instead of keeping that and hiding it in his heart and just trusting and letting God do his thing, he goes and just kind of like rubs his brother's nose and, hey, let me tell y'all what God said. Y'all going to bow down to me. You know, he kind of starts off as a spoiled brat. But by the time he's done, he's very stately, right? He's rose to the second man in charge in Egypt, and he's got a wife and kids, and he's restoring his family, and he's looking at his family and saying, hey, you guys meant it for evil, but God used it for good. Don't worry about it. I ain't going to kill you. You know,
yes, he humbled himself.
Yeah, his character has developed over the entirety of it, right?
Yes, sir.
So that's narrative character, narrative exegesis, so to speak. And you can read more about that in this section too. It's really intriguing. I think it does highlight it. Nicodemus, we talked about Nicodemus a while ago. The character of Nicodemus is developed beautifully in the book of John. He comes to Jesus by night. He's afraid to talk to Jesus. He thinks Jesus is truly sent by God, but he don't know who exactly Jesus is or what his mission is. He talks to Jesus a little bit, but at the end of the Gospel of John, when Jesus has been crucified, he boldly goes into Pilate, Nicodemus does, and says, let me get his body. I want to properly dispose of it and bury it in a good and ceremonial way. So he's come from going to Jesus at night, scared of what other people would think, to following Jesus as a disciple to the point of being able to put his life on the line, going to Pilate and saying, give me his body. I want to properly honor my Lord, right? So Nicodemus apparently has come a long ways, but that's his character development throughout the narrative and throughout the story. All right, that's sort of the end of the section on detailed analysis. Let me just stop there for just a minute. Synthesis won't take us long, but I do want to talk about synthesis. But before we go there, anything that was completely foreign or off the charts, off your radar, and you're like, man, I'm still confused, please help me with the detailed analysis before we move. Anybody got anything? If not, let's get some thumbs up and make sure we got everybody on board. Everybody's on board? All right, let's move on. Okay, you got
I have one question.
Okay.
Our paper the paper that we turn in for next week is just going to be elements 4 and 5.
That's correct.
Of Isaiah,
Yes,
right?
that's correct.
We don't have to go back and.
No.
Okay, we don't have to go back and turn in.
No.
Okay.
Anything that you didn't do right on the last week's assignment was for your edification when I sent you the words back, so that you're starting to do it right on the other paper you're doing for the class at the end of class. Because hopefully, as I said all along, you're going through, you're doing that work on that other passage at the same time you're doing it on Isaiah, right? Because you kind of know how to do historical research on Isaiah, so go ahead and do historical research on your paper. You kind of know how to do formal analysis on Isaiah, so do formal analysis on your paper. Now you know how to do detailed analysis on Isaiah this week. Go ahead and sort of be doing detailed analysis, but now go back and look at the remarks I made on your paper from last week, and if there was something you were doing blatantly wrong or something you could add that to your work for the paper for the coming weeks. Okay?
Okay.
All right, so synthesis.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Synthesis. What is the main point, or what are the main points, plural, of the text? To synthesize is to pull various elements together into some kind of unified whole. Synthesizing, then, is a disciplined but creative act of integration. Integration is the exact opposite of disintegration, right? So disintegration is something that is together, breaking apart, to disintegrate. So if you're going to integrate something, what are you going to do? Something that is apart, you're going to pull it together, right? Exactly. So you got historical, social, cultural, detailed analysis, formal analysis, structure, movement. You got all these parts. What are you trying to do? Bring them together to one whole, right? And say in one, maybe 2 paragraphs, this is what I've tried to say all along, and I've boiled it down. I've distilled it. I hate to use this analogy because it's maybe not the best analogy for the church, but every once in a while I see that television show on TV about moonshiners. And moonshiners, they put all this, they call it mash, in one bucket, and they heat it up, and it goes through a coil and goes through some cold water. It comes out the other end as steam, and that's that moonshine. That's the pure alcohol, right? They take all the other stuff off of it, bring it down, and distill it. That's what you're trying to do here. You got a whole barrel full of mash with your research you've done at this point. Now you want to carry it through that condensing thing and condense it down to the bare essentials. What's most important here? And so what are you going to ask yourself in this? Got a couple of questions you can ask, as he says on page 128. Again, these are some of the same questions you've already asked, but the one I want you to focus on is number 3 on that top list of bullet points. What claims did this text make on the original hearers, readers? What response might the author have desired from those readers and hearers? What effects, intentional or not, might have the text had on those original readers? So synthesis is about what did this mean to the original readers, right? Now, that being said, page 129, we want to start talking about what he says is a quality of interpretations. Different interpreters are going to arrive at different interpretations or syntheses of the text. And the same interpreter, whether exegete or preacher, will likely have various interpretations of a text depending on the context in which the interpretation takes place. Indeed, most of us hope that a preacher does not say the exact same thing about a text year in and year out, because you may have to preach the same text again sometime, right? So you want to come to some slight new nuance of the passage. To illustrate both the importance of arriving at a synthesis and the variety of the possible synthesis, we may look at several possible interpretations of a famous text in Paul's letter to the Philippians, Philippians chapter 2, verse 6 through 11. Now, on page 130, he gives you like 5 different interpretations that all come from a legitimate exegesis of this passage. And he says in this section, and I'm trying to remember where he says it at because I wanted to highlight that. But basically he says, okay, there it is on page 132. Go ahead and turn over to page 132, and we'll get back to the other word in just a second. Ambiguity, whether intentional or not, also allows for various interpretations of a text, all of which, if arrived at responsibly, have some claim to validity. So he says it's not a free, no holds barred. In other words, every interpretation is equally as valid as another one. But he says if you go through these steps that have been agreed upon by the entirety of Christian history to this point, if you read the text in its context and go through all these steps and you come to a slightly different interpretation than someone else, then it's probably a legitimate interpretation even though it differs. That does not mean that if you just say, I want the text to mean this, that means that that's legitimate, right? Because there's a lot of people who would like to twist the Bible and make it say what they want it to say, and that is not a legitimate exegesis. So following the steps, if you come to a slightly different interpretation, that's still probably okay, all right? And what he says there is ambiguity and polyvalence or polyvalence. The word veil is the word for like to hide something, to veil it, right? You know, veil over a bride, but it also has to do with reading or voice, a voice that's spoken. So poly means more than one, right? So polyvalence or polyvalence means more than one voice, multivocal. And ambiguity means more than one way to rightly read something or to say something. I'll give you a very shallow example of something that is ambiguous. Jesus was going to town where Zacchaeus lived, and Zacchaeus wanted to see Jesus, but he could not because he was short. Now, it does not tell us in the text that it was Zacchaeus that was short or Jesus that was short. It says he. And in the Greek and in the English, by the way, the he can modify either Zacchaeus or Jesus in that sentence. Zacchaeus wanted to see Jesus, but he couldn't because the crowds were so large and he was short. He who? He Jesus or he Zacchaeus? We believe it was Zacchaeus. It probably was Zacchaeus. But if somebody thinks that it was Jesus and they went through the process of interpreting that passage, the ambiguity in that passage is sufficient that we can't say it wasn't Jesus. Does that make sense? So either one of those interpretations are legitimate. One is probably a little more legitimate than the other based on what we know of history. Nowhere else in the Bible does it say Jesus was short. So it's probably Zacchaeus that was short. But the ambiguity makes it such that you could read that either way. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, when he says that a passage has multi-voices or polyvoices, polyvalence, he means that there are times when a passage says one thing to one generation and it may say something else to the next generation in light of what it said to the last generation. So it's got a secondary meaning. So let's look at the passage we've been dealing with this entire class thus far is Isaiah, right? Isaiah is about what's happening in their day and time. There's no doubt about that. If you read that passage from chapter 7, verse 1 through verse 15, the entirety of that passage is about Isaiah, Ahaz, Syria, and Israel joining up to fight against Judah, and Assyria in the background, and Ahaz going around and trying to lean on Assyria instead of fighting against these two nations. And Isaiah gives a sign that God will be with us if we just stand still and don't do anything, try to take matters into our own hands. He's going to give you this young woman, and I can see Isaiah in my mind looking at a young woman who's standing right there in the presence of the king and says, you see that young woman right there? She's pregnant. And by the time she has her child, and he's old enough to know the difference between right and wrong, which in Israel is a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah, right? Child of the law, about 12 to 14 years of age. within 12 to 14 years, the two kings who you're scared of, Ahaz, are going to be dethroned because Assyria is coming to get them. So don't do anything, just trust God. That's the message. But because there's ambiguity in that word Alma, and it can also mean virgin, how do you think Matthew reads that passage? When he looks back in the Old Testament and he's trying to find passages that legitimate the birth of Christ to a virgin, Mary, he looks back at Isaiah and says, see, this was said 700 years ago that a virgin would conceive, and that would mean God is with us. If we don't try to take matters into our own hands and save ourselves and only trust God, then we will be, we'll be given the sign of Emmanuel, which is Jesus, right? So Jesus is coming to bear the sins of the world. That is a legitimate theological reading of Isaiah. But it's not what it meant to Isaiah and Ahaz in the first telling of it, right? It's a secondary meaning. And I want you to look and see what he says on the bottom of page 132, where he's talking about this. He says, specialist, this is the last paragraph in the bottom of page 132. Specialists in hermeneutics, that is interpretation, often refer to this phenomenon as the surplus of meaning. In text, Christians, especially Catholic theologians, speak particularly with respect to the Old Testament text as having been understood by Christians to point to Christ as a text sensus plenor. In other words, that's Latin for the sensus, the fuller sense of the text. The Latin phrase means fuller sense, the meaning intended by God, but not necessarily by the human author. In other words, Isaiah probably didn't know anything about that passage being a prediction of the Messiah, right? The prediction is what's getting ready to happen in the next 14 years to the two northern kingdoms because you trusted in God, if you trust in God. But the fulfillment of the passage, which is supernatural and is bigger than Isaiah, this is God working behind the scenes. That's about Jesus. Does that make sense to everybody? So you see how if you were going to be doing a synthesis of the work that we've done thus far, and by the way, I'm kind of giving you a hint for the help for your homework for this week, right? If you're doing the synthesis after you've done your detailed analysis now, you've got all the history, you've got all the formal analysis, you've got all the detailed analysis, now you're going to synthesize it. You're going to talk about what it meant to Isaiah and Ahaz in their day and time. Talk about what the passage meant to them. It would be until reflection that you start talking about what it means now to us today in light of Jesus. That's a theological, a deeper sense of the passage, a secondary meaning, right? So for the exegesis, we want to get at what it meant to them. And that's where you're going to synthesize all your data and what it meant. But then when you get to reflection, which is next week, you can actually theologize about how, okay, in light of what it meant to them, and this is what it meant, just stand still, trust God. This is how we are saved in the New Testament. We have to just stand still, trust God, not of our own works. This is by grace, through faith, not of ourselves, gift of God, right? All of that kind of stuff. Does all of that make sense? Any questions then about synthesis and bringing it to a consensus of what you think it meant for them in their day and time? You got something, Johnny? I see you talking, but you're muted.
I was just saying, bring the text together.
Yes.
With the sympathies, just
yes,
connecting everything.
Yep. And on page 137 under the chapter summary, you see those bullet points? The first one says this: synthesizing is not merely summarizing, but rather creating an act of drawing a conclusion about what the meaning and the function of the text was in that first century or at that time when it was written. Now, next week when we get back together, we're going to go with the reflection, the theological interpretation. We'll talk about that next week. and our class may be even a little bit shorter next week because of that, and it'll give you more time to work on your work. But we'll also unpack anything that you are confused about up till this point. So let me just pause right here and see if there's any questions about detailed analysis or synthesis before we let you guys go and have a good evening. Wayne, you got a question?
I'm reading over my stuff, making sure I got everything. So.
Gotcha. Yeah, okay. Jeff, you good? Got a thumbs up there, Miss Nyoka. Got a thumbs up there. Johnny?
Like you say, it's a lot of material.
It is a lot of work,
Oh,
a lot of material.
that Anchor, what is that Anchor thing you had said, that book?
The Anchor Bible Dictionary.
Anchor Bible Dictionary, okay.
Yep. And if you don't have a copy, there's one at the Jacksonville location. There's one in the Mount Olive. Of course, there's one at the Mount Olive location. There's one in the library at the Mount Olive location. The Mount Olive location also has the reference section that you can get the New Interpreter's Bible and use in the library. You can't take it out, but there are some New Interpreter's Bibles upstairs in the stacks that you can check out. And if you go to Mount Olive to actually do some research one day, if it's during the, yeah, you got it there, New Interpreter's Bible. There you go, Jeff. Where'd you get that at, buddy? Did you purchase that?
No, this one comes from Mount Olive College.
Oh, from Mount Olive. Okay, so you've been up there and checked it out.
But it didn't have Acts, but this one is Hebrews, James, 1st, 2nd Peter, John, Jude, and Revelation.
Okay. Say again, Johnny.
Series. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a
I was
12.
asking Jeff, it's a series.
It's a 12-volume series. Yeah, so it goes from Genesis to Revelation. So there's 12 volumes. There's a whole set in the New Religion Center in the chapel there, right near. In fact, it's in the room right beside my office, and that room stays open for religion students. So if you happen to be in the Mount Olive area and you can't get to the Jacksonville or the New Bern or the Washington sites, because there's one in Jacksonville, there's one in New Bern, there's one in Washington as well. You can go to the Lee Glover Center, and during the day it's usually unlocked, and that room will be wide open. You can use it in there, and you can get some copies. So if you go to the sites, usually the site directors don't mind doing some copies for you. Just make sure if you copy the information that you're going to use for your paper, also copy the front page, like the publication date and all that stuff that you would use to cite it with. All right.
Mm-hmm.
Any last questions or comments? Everybody good? I got thumbs up.
Okay.
All right. Everybody's good. Well, God's blessings upon you. If you need me between now and next week, you know how to get a hold of me through email. You got my cell phone. You can text or call. Just call me or text me or email me, and I should be able to get back with you right quick like.
Yes, sir. And prayers with you tomorrow. We pray to God that everything is wonderful.
Thank you so much, Johnny. I do appreciate if y'all would remember me tomorrow morning about 9 o'clock, and everything will come out well with that test.
Yes, sir.
God's richest blessings on y'all tonight, and I'll see you Monday night if I don't see you before.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
All right. Good
One
night.
other question.